In a busy city neighborhood where the streets buzzed with life and people went about their daily routines, there was an officer named Daniel Hayes. He wasn't your average cop, at least not in the way he carried himself or treated others. Hayes had built a reputation over the years for being abrasive, quick to judge, and often targeting people based on the color of their skin. His actions weren't subtle. They were loud, aggressive, and left many feeling uneasy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky orange and purple, Hayes was patrolling near a local park. It was just another shift for him, cruising through familiar streets while keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. The park itself was usually quiet during this time of day, except for a few joggers winding down after work or parents hurrying home with their kids. But tonight, something, or rather someone, caught his attention. On one of the benches near the edge of the park sat a young black woman. She looked tired, her head resting in her hands as if lost in thought. Her red jacket stood out against the muted tones of the fading light. To most people passing by, she seemed harmless, a regular person taking a moment to breathe before heading home. But to Hayes, she fit a vague description that had come across his radio earlier. A black woman wearing a red jacket, wanted for questioning in connection with a recent theft at a nearby store. Without hesitation, Hayes pulled his patrol car to the curb and stepped out. His boots clicked against the pavement as he approached her, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "Hey," he called out sharply, his voice cutting through the calm evening air. Startled, the woman looked up, confusion written all over her face. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," Hayes replied curtly, barely glancing at her as he reached for his handcuffs. "Stand up." The woman blinked, clearly taken aback. "Wait, what? I'm just sitting here waiting for my ride. I haven't done anything wrong." But Hayes wasn't listening. In his mind, she already fit the profile. He didn't need more evidence than that. "Save it," he snapped, grabbing her arm roughly and pulling her to her feet. "We'll sort this out at the station." She tried to protest again, explaining that she worked downtown and had only stopped at the park to rest for a few minutes. But Hayes wasn't interested in hearing excuses. His grip tightened as he secured the handcuffs around her wrists, ignoring her pleas. For him, this was routine, an arrest like any other. What he failed to realize, however, was that this wasn't just another case of mistaken identity. This was about to become far bigger than either of them could have imagined. As Hayes led her to the patrol car, the woman glanced around helplessly, hoping someone might intervene. But the park was mostly empty now, save for a couple walking, their dog in the distance. They noticed the scene unfolding but kept moving, unsure of what to do. Feeling defeated, the woman climbed into the back seat of the cruiser, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and frustration. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a story that would shake the entire community and force some hard truths into the light. Hayes drove in silence, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of wrapping up this case quickly so he could call it a night. He didn't bother asking her name or giving her a chance to explain herself further. To him, she was just another suspect, one who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But as fate would have it, this particular woman wasn't who Hayes thought she was, and soon enough he'd learn that lesson in the most unexpected and humbling way possible. The ride to the police station was long and uncomfortable. The woman sat in the back seat of the patrol car, her hands still cuffed behind her back. She stared out the window, watching the city blur past as the officer drove in silence. Her mind raced with questions. Why was this happening? What had she done to deserve this treatment? She hadn't broken any laws, and yet here she was, treated like a criminal. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest, but she tried to stay calm. Losing her composure wouldn't help. She needed to think clearly if she wanted to get out of this mess. When they arrived at the precinct, the officer led her inside without saying a word. The building was bustling with activity, uniformed officers moving around, phones ringing, and people sitting nervously in the waiting area. It smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, a mix that seemed oddly fitting for such a place. The woman was taken to a small desk where another officer began processing her arrest. He looked up briefly, his expression blank, before turning back to his computer. "Name?" he asked, his voice monotone. She hesitated for a moment, then answered firmly. "I already told him my name. I'm not the person you're looking for." The officer ignored her comment and typed something into the system. A few seconds later, his brow furrowed. "Hold on," he muttered under his breath. He double-checked the information, clicking through different screens. Something didn't add up. "What's going on?" she asked, leaning forward slightly despite the cuffs digging into her wrists. "You're making a mistake." He glanced at her, unsure of what to say. Finally, he turned to the arresting officer who was standing nearby. "Hey, are you sure about this? This doesn't look right." Hayes rolled his eyes, annoyed by the interruption. "Of course I'm sure she fits the description. Red jacket, black woman, that's all we got." The second officer hesitated, glancing between Hayes and the screen. "Yeah, but according to this, she's clean. No record. And..." He trailed off, his eyes widening slightly as more details appeared. "Wait a minute, hold on, this can't be right." The room fell silent for a moment. Everyone stopped what they were doing, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. The woman raised an eyebrow, curious now. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady, but laced with suspicion. The officer cleared his throat, looking visibly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, can you confirm your full name again?" She sighed, exasperated but willing to cooperate. "Yes, I've already said it twice. My name is Tanya Williams." Another pause. The officer typed her name into the system once more, and this time the results came back immediately. His face went pale. "Oh boy," he muttered, shaking his head. This is bad." Tanya leaned forward even more, straining against the handcuffs. "What's bad? What did you find?" The officer exchanged a nervous glance with Hayes before speaking. "Ma'am, according to our records, you're employed by the U.S. Department of Justice. You're a federal prosecutor." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a split second, no one moved or spoke. Then, chaos erupted. Officers started whispering to each other, some looking horrified while others seemed angry. Hayes, meanwhile, turned bright red, his jaw clenched tightly. He opened his mouth to argue but quickly shut it again, realizing how foolish he must look. Tanya, for her part, felt a surge of both relief and anger. Relief because she finally had proof that she wasn't who they thought she was, and anger because none of this should have happened in the first place. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Well," she said dryly, "it's nice to know you eventually figured it out." One of the senior officers stepped forward, his face grim. "Ma'am, I apologize deeply for this misunderstanding. We'll get those cuffs off you right away." As they removed the handcuffs, Tanya rubbed her sore wrists, wincing slightly. But she didn't say anything. Not yet. She knew this was far from over. While the officers scrambled to figure out how to handle the situation, she sat quietly, letting the gravity of the moment sink in. These people had arrested her, a federal prosecutor, based solely on a vague description and their own biases. If this could happen to her, someone with power and resources, what did that mean for everyone else? Eventually, the senior officer returned, looking apologetic but also defensive. "Ma'am, we're going to need to verify your identity further. Do you have any ID on you?" Tanya nodded and reached into her pocket, pulling out her government-issued badge. She held it up so everyone could see. "Here's my badge, and if you'd like, I can call my supervisor to confirm who I am." The room grew eerily quiet. Some of the officers recognized her badge immediately. It was the same one they'd seen countless times in courtrooms during high-profile cases. One of them whispered, "That's her. She's prosecuted half the drug cases we've worked on." Hayes stood frozen, his face burning with embarrassment. He wanted to disappear, but there was nowhere to hide. Instead, he stammered, "Look, it was just a misunderstanding. Anyone could have made the same mistake. Tanya fixed him with a cold stare. No, not anyone. Only someone who sees a black woman in a red jacket and assumes she's guilty without asking questions. Her words hit hard, silencing the room once again. The senior officer cleared his throat awkwardly. "Ma'am, we'll do everything we can to make this right. Please let us know how we can assist you." Tanya crossed her arms, her mind racing. She could feel the tension in the room, the discomfort of the officers who now realized they'd messed up big time. Part of her wanted to storm out and never look back, but she knew this wasn't just about her. This was about accountability, for them and for the countless others who had been wrongfully targeted because of the color of their skin. "I'll decide what happens next," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the silence. "But trust me, this isn't over." The air in the precinct was thick with tension. After the shocking revelation about Tanya's identity, the room had gone eerily quiet. Officers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do next. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others whispered among themselves, their voices low and urgent. The senior officer who had stepped in earlier tried to take control of the situation, but it was clear that no one really knew how to handle this mess. Tanya stood there, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. She wasn't yelling or screaming, she didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes. Every second that ticked by felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the entire department's mistakes was pressing down on everyone in the room. But Tanya wasn't interested in empty apologies or awkward attempts at damage control. She wanted answers, and she wasn't going to leave until she got them. Finally, the senior officer cleared his throat and approached her cautiously. "Ma'am," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "we deeply regret what happened here tonight. This shouldn't have happened." Tanya raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You're telling me something I already know," she replied coolly. "What I want to understand is why it happened. Why did your officer arrest me without even bothering to ask my name? Why did he assume I was guilty based on nothing more than a vague description?" The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. The senior officer shifted uncomfortably, searching for the right words. I can't speak for Officer Hayes," he stammered. "But I assure you, we'll get to the bottom of this. We'll conduct a full investigation into how this occurred." Tanya let out a humorless laugh. "An investigation? That's great. But it doesn't change the fact that I was handcuffed, brought here, and treated like a criminal, all because of the color of my skin. You think this hasn't happened before? To other people who don't have the luxury of being a federal prosecutor?" Her words hit hard, cutting through the room like a knife. Some officers looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Others shuffled uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with where this conversation was headed. Hayes, meanwhile, stood off to the side, his face red with a mix of anger and shame. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but quickly closed it again, when Tanya turned her piercing stare toward him. "This isn't just about me," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "It's about every person who's been stopped, harassed, or arrested because someone decided they fit the description. It's about the systemic issues in law enforcement that allow this kind of thing to happen over and over again. And unless you're willing to address those issues, this apology means nothing." The room fell silent once more. No one dared to interrupt her. Even Hayes, who had initially dismissed her protests, seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. For the first time, he realized just how serious this situation was, and how much trouble he might be in. After a long pause, the senior officer nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right, ma'am. This goes beyond tonight's incident. We owe it not only to you, but to our community to make things right. Please, tell us what steps you'd like us to take." Tanya thought for a moment, weighing her options. She could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of public backlash, lawsuits, and media attention. But she also saw an opportunity to push for real change, to hold these people accountable for their actions, and to shine a light on the injustices faced by so many. "First," she said firmly, "I want a formal apology, not just from Officer Hayes, but from the entire department. Second, I expect a thorough investigation into this incident, including an examination of the policies and practices that allowed it to happen. Third, she paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Third, I'm filing a formal complaint, not just against Officer Hayes, but against the system that enables behavior like this. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Filing a complaint was bad enough, but mentioning the word system sent chills down their spines. They knew all too well what that meant: scrutiny, headlines, and possibly even federal intervention. This wasn't just a local issue anymore. It had the potential to blow up into something much bigger. Hayes finally found his voice, though it came out shaky and defensive. Look, I made a mistake, okay? I admit it. But you have to understand, I was just doing my job. People give us descriptions, and we act on them. That's how it works. Tanya fixed him with a cold glare. No, that's how you work. Acting on assumptions instead of facts. Treating people as guilty until proven innocent. And guess what? Your job almost ruined mine, and it has ruined countless lives. Her tone softened slightly, but only for a moment. I'm not saying this to humiliate you or tear you down. I'm saying it because I want you to understand the impact of your actions. Because if you don't, then nothing will ever change. The room remained silent, the gravity of her words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Hayes looked down at his shoes, unable to respond. For the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless. The tables had turned, and he was now the one being judged. As the night wore on, Tanya left the precinct, still reeling from the events that had unfolded. Though she was free to go, the experience lingered with her, gnawing at her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been wrongfully targeted, disrespected, or dehumanized by those meant to protect them. Back at the station, panic set in among the officers. Phone calls were made, emails sent, and meetings scheduled. Internal Affairs launched an immediate investigation, knowing full well that this story wouldn't stay contained within the walls of the precinct. Word spread quickly, reaching higher-ups in the department and eventually making its way to the press. By morning, the news had broken. Headlines blared across newspapers and TV screens. Federal prosecutor wrongfully arrested due to racial profiling. Social media erupted with outrage, hashtags trending as people shared stories of similar experiences. Activists rallied behind Tanya, praising her courage and calling for reforms. Meanwhile, supporters of law enforcement scrambled to defend Hayes, arguing that he was simply following protocol. But deep down, everyone involved knew the truth. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was a glaring example of a broken system. And whether they liked it or not, Tanya's arrest had sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored. For Tanya, the fight was far from over. As she sat alone in her apartment that night, staring at the city lights outside her window, she made a promise to herself. She would use this experience, not just to seek justice for herself, but to demand accountability from those in power. Because if even a federal prosecutor wasn't safe from racial profiling, then no one was. The next morning, the city woke up to a firestorm. News of the wrongful arrest had spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and social media feeds. People were outraged, not just because of what happened to Tanya, but because it was yet another reminder of the deep-rooted issues within law enforcement. It wasn't hard to find voices chiming in on the matter. Some shared personal stories of being profiled or mistreated by police officers, while others demanded immediate action. The public reaction was swift, loud, and impossible to ignore. Tanya knew this was her moment to speak. She couldn't let the momentum die down without addressing the issue head-on. So, early that afternoon, she stepped out of her apartment, dressed professionally in a sharp navy suit that commanded respect. Her hair was neatly styled and her posture radiated confidence. This wasn't about revenge or personal vindication. It was about sending a message. With her lawyer by her side, she walked into the bustling crowd gathered outside the courthouse where she often prosecuted cases. Reporters jostled for position, cameras clicking and microphones thrust forward as she approached the podium. For a brief moment, Tanya paused, taking in the scene before her. She scanned the faces in the crowd, some angry, some curious, some hopeful, and drew a deep breath. Then, with a calm but powerful voice, she began to speak. "Good afternoon," she started, her tone steady and measured. "Many of you have heard about what happened to me last night. I was arrested, not because I committed a crime, but because someone saw my skin color and decided I must be guilty. That's not justice. That's prejudice." Her words landed like a punch, silencing the murmurs in the crowd. Every eye was fixed on her, hanging onto every syllable. She continued, her voice rising slightly as she recounted the events of the previous evening. She described how she had been sitting peacefully in the park, minding her own business when an officer approached her aggressively. She explained how he ignored her explanations, dismissed her protests, and treated her like a suspect simply because she matched a description. "I'm a federal prosecutor," she reminded the audience, her voice tinged with both frustration and resolve. "I've spent years fighting for justice, holding criminals accountable, and working to protect our communities. Yet none of that mattered when I was standing there in handcuffs. All that mattered was the color of my skin." The crowd erupted into murmurs again, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Tanya waited for the noise to subside before continuing. "This isn't just about me," she emphasized, pointing directly at the reporters. "It's about everyone who doesn't have a badge, a title, or a platform to defend themselves. It's about the black men and women who are stopped, searched, and harassed every single day because of assumptions rooted in bias. It's about the lives that have been lost, the families torn apart, and the trust broken between communities and those sworn to protect them." She paused, letting her words sink in. Her gaze swept across the sea of faces once more, searching for understanding. "I'm here today because I refuse to stay silent. I'm here to demand accountability, not just from the officer who arrested me, but from the entire system that allows this kind of behavior to happen over and over again. We need transparency. We need reform. And most importantly, we need change." The arrestor. Applause that followed was thunderous. People clapped, cheered, and chanted slogans like "No justice, no peace," and "Enough is enough." Tanya stood quietly, allowing the energy of the moment to wash over her. She hadn't expected such an overwhelming response, but she welcomed it. This was exactly what she had hoped for, a spark to ignite a larger movement. As the press conference wrapped up, reporters bombarded her with questions. "What actions will you take next?" one asked. "Do you plan to sue the department?" another pressed. Tanya answered calmly, reiterating her commitment to seeking justice and pushing for systemic reforms. "This isn't about money or punishment," she said. "It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through what I did. If that means filing a lawsuit, so be it. But my focus is on creating lasting change." By the time she left the courthouse, the story had gone viral. Social media platforms were flooded with posts supporting Tanya, sharing her speech and calling for reforms. Activists organized rallies outside police stations, demanding answers and accountability. Even some members of law enforcement voiced their support, acknowledging the need for better training and oversight. The conversation had shifted from a single incident to a broader discussion about racial profiling, implicit bias, and police misconduct. Back at the precinct, panic had reached new heights. Internal affairs investigators combed through records, reviewing body cam footage and interviewing witnesses. Hayes, the arresting officer, became the center of attention, both inside and outside the department. His colleagues distanced themselves from him, fearing association with the controversy. Meanwhile, his superiors scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing statements about their commitment to fairness and equality. But behind closed doors, tensions ran high. Everyone knew that this wasn't just a PR nightmare. It was a reckoning. For Tanya, the days that followed were a whirlwind. She appeared on talk shows, gave interviews to major news outlets, and met with community leaders to discuss potential solutions. Despite the chaos, she remained focused and composed. She understood the weight of her position and the responsibility that came with it. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in justice and equality. But as much as she inspired others, Tanya also carried the emotional toll of the experience. Late at night, when the cameras were off and the crowds had dispersed, she found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought about the fear she felt during her arrest, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, and the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. More than anything, she thought about the countless people who didn't have the resources or platform to fight back. Those thoughts fueled her determination to keep pushing forward. One evening, as she sat alone in her living room, scrolling through messages of support on her phone, she received a call from an old friend. "You're making waves," the friend said, admiration clear in their voice. "People are listening. You're giving them hope." Tanya smiled faintly, though her expression was tinged with sadness. "Hope is important," she replied. "But hope alone won't fix this. We need action. Real, tangible change. And I'm not stopping until we get it." Her friend hesitated, then asked softly, "Are you okay? Really?" Tanya sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I'll be fine," she said after a pause. "This isn't easy, but it's necessary. If my story can help even one person feel seen or push for reforms that save lives, then it's worth it." With that, she ended the call and turned off her phone. Outside her window, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath its surface. Tanya knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But she also knew that change rarely came without struggle. And if anyone could lead the charge, it was her. The lawsuit was officially filed 2 weeks after the incident. Tanya didn't waste any time dragging her feet. She knew that momentum was key if she wanted to keep the pressure on. With a team of top-notch civil rights attorneys by her side, she laid out her case in painstaking detail. The document was thick, filled with evidence of not just her wrongful arrest but also patterns of misconduct within the police department. It wasn't just about Officer Hayes anymore. It was about exposing a system that allowed officers like him to act recklessly without consequence. As soon as the lawsuit hit the news cycle, the city erupted once again. Protesters took to the streets holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "End racial profiling." Activists organized marches, speeches, and vigils, turning Tanya's personal ordeal into a rallying cry for reform. Even people who had never been directly affected by racial profiling found themselves moved by her story. For many, this was the wake-up call they needed, a stark reminder that no one was immune, not even someone as powerful as a federal prosecutor. Inside the courtroom, however, things were far less glamorous. The trial began months later, after countless hearings, motions, and delays. Each day brought new twists and turns, with both sides digging deep to prove their point. Tanya sat at the plaintiff's table alongside her lawyers, her expression calm but resolute. She listened intently as witnesses testified, some recounting similar experiences of profiling, while others defended the actions of the police department. Through it all, she remained composed, refusing to let her emotions get the better of her. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from body cam footage captured during her arrest. When played in court, the video painted a vivid picture of what had happened that night. Viewers could see how Hayes approached her aggressively, barely giving her a chance to explain herself before slapping on the handcuffs. They could hear the frustration in her voice as she tried to reason with him, only to be met with dismissive responses. And perhaps most telling of all, they could feel the tension in the air, the unmistakable sense that something was deeply wrong. The jury watched the footage in stunned silence. Some members exchanged glances, clearly troubled by what they saw. Others scribbled notes furiously, their pens scratching against paper as they absorbed every detail. When the clip ended, Tanya's lead attorney stood up and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice firm and commanding, "this isn't just a case of mistaken identity. This is a textbook example of racial profiling, a practice that has no place in our society." Hayes, meanwhile, struggled under the weight of the scrutiny. On the stand, He fumbled through his testimony, contradicting himself multiple times. His attempts to justify his actions fell flat, especially when confronted with evidence showing a history of discriminatory behavior. Former colleagues reluctantly testified about past incidents involving Hayes, describing him as quick-tempered and biased. One officer even admitted to feeling uneasy working alongside him, though he hadn't spoken up until now for fear of retaliation. Outside the courtroom, public opinion continued to sway heavily in Tanya's favor. Social media campaigns gained traction, drawing attention to systemic issues within law enforcement. Hashtags like Accountability Now and Justice for Tanya trended nationwide, sparking conversations about privilege, bias, and the need for reform. Community leaders held town halls, inviting citizens to share their thoughts and propose solutions. Even politicians weighed in, promising to introduce legislation aimed at addressing these long-standing problems. But not everyone supported Tanya's efforts. Critics argued that she was making too big a deal out of a simple mistake, accusing her of using her position to stir up trouble. Some backers of law enforcement claimed that Hayes was being unfairly targeted, insisting that he was simply doing his job. These voices, though loud, were vastly outnumbered by those calling for change. Still, their presence served as a reminder of how polarizing the issue of police accountability truly was. Back at home, Tanya juggled her responsibilities as a federal prosecutor with the demands of the trial. It wasn't easy balancing her career with her fight for justice, but she refused to let either slip. Late nights became the norm as she pored over legal documents, strategized with her attorneys, and prepared for upcoming appearances. Despite the exhaustion, she felt a strange sense of purpose, a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, her work inside the courtroom and outside of it aligned perfectly. Her family and friends rallied around her, offering support whenever they could. They attended hearings, shared updates online, and reminded her to take care of herself amidst the chaos. One evening, over dinner at her apartment, a close friend looked at her and said, "You're carrying so much, right now. Are you sure you don't want to step back even just a little?" Tanya shook her head, smiling faintly. "I can't," she replied. "Not yet. This isn't just about me. It's bigger than me. If I stop now, what message does that send? That we should settle for half measures? That we should accept injustice as long as it doesn't affect us personally?" Her friend nodded, understanding where she was coming from. "Just promise me you'll take breaks," he said gently. "You've got a lot riding on your shoulders." "I will," she promised, though deep down, she knew rest would have to wait. There was still so much to do. As the trial dragged on, tensions reached a boiling point. Hayes grew increasingly defensive, lashing out at anyone who dared question his integrity. His lawyer fought tooth and nail to discredit Tanya's claims, but the evidence stacked against them made it an uphill battle. Witnesses recounted harrowing tales of profiling and mistreatment, painting a grim picture of life under the shadow of systemic racism. By the time closing arguments rolled around, the courtroom was packed, with people spilling out into the hallways just to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. Tanya's attorney delivered a powerful speech, urging the jury to consider the broader implications of their decision. "This isn't just about one woman or one officer," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "It's about whether we as a society are willing to confront the biases that divide us. It's about whether we choose to protect those who abuse their power or hold them accountable for their actions." When the defense finally presented its closing statement, it landed with a dull thud. Their arguments felt weak, almost desperate, compared to the mountain of evidence piling up against them. As the judge instructed the jury to begin deliberations, the room buzzed with anticipation. Everyone knew this verdict would carry significant weight, not just for Tanya and Hayes, but for the future of policing and accountability. For Tanya, waiting was the hardest part. She tried to stay busy, immersing herself in work and spending time with loved ones. But no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, her mind kept drifting back to the courtroom. What would the jury decide? Would they see the truth, or would they turn a blind eye? She didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at her relentlessly, Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed once again, the air thick with anticipation. As the foreman stood to deliver the decision, Tanya clasped her hands tightly in her lap, bracing herself for whatever came next. When the words, "guilty on all counts," rang out, a wave of relief washed over her. Cheers erupted from the crowd and tears streamed down her face as the reality sank in. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the door for change had been cracked open just a little wider, and Tanya knew this was only the beginning. The verdict echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Guilty on all counts. For a moment there was complete silence. Then, as if released from an invisible hold, the room erupted into cheers and applause. Supporters jumped to their feet, clapping and shouting words of encouragement. Tanya sat frozen in her seat, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. She hadn't dared to hope for this outcome, not fully. But now that it was real, she felt a flood of emotion she couldn't quite put into words. Hayes, on the other hand, looked like he'd been hit by a truck. His face turned pale, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed like it might crack. He avoided eye contact with anyone, staring instead at the floor as if hoping it would swallow him whole. His lawyer whispered something into his ear, but whatever it was didn't seem to offer much comfort. The reality of the situation was setting in. He wasn't just guilty in the eyes of the court. He was exposed, humiliated, and facing serious consequences for his actions. The judge wasted no time delivering the sentence. Hayes was immediately suspended from duty pending termination proceedings. Additionally, the department agreed to implement sweeping reforms aimed at addressing systemic issues within its ranks. These included mandatory anti-bias training, stricter oversight of police conduct, and the establishment of an independent review board to handle complaints against officers. While these changes wouldn't undo the harm already done, they represented a step toward accountability. A small but meaningful victory for Tanya and those who stood behind her. Outside the courthouse, chaos reigned. Reporters shouted questions at Tanya as she emerged, flanked by her legal team. Cameras flashed, capturing every expression, every movement. But Tanya didn't shy away. Instead, she stepped up to the mic one final time, her voice steady despite the whirlwind around her. "This isn't just my victory," she said firmly, looking directly into the cameras. "It belongs to everyone who has ever been wronged by a system that's supposed to protect them. Today we proved that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it." Her words resonated deeply, sparking renewed calls for reform. Across the country, activists hailed the decision as a landmark moment, proof that persistence and courage could lead to change. Politicians scrambled to draft legislation inspired by Tanya's case, eager to capitalize on the momentum. Meanwhile, critics grumbled about overreach and political correctness, but their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming demand for justice. Back at work, Tanya returned to her role as a federal prosecutor with renewed determination. If anything, the trial had reignited her passion for fighting inequality. She threw herself into cases involving civil rights violations, police brutality, and institutional racism, using her platform to amplify marginalized voices. Her colleagues noticed the shift. She worked longer hours, pushed harder for convictions, and refused to back down when faced with resistance. Some admired her tenacity, while others found her intensity intimidating. Either way, no one doubted her commitment to making a difference. But Tanya wasn't content to limit her impact to the courtroom. She began speaking at conferences, writing op-eds, and appearing on panels to discuss the importance of accountability and reform. Her story became a beacon of hope for countless individuals who had endured similar injustices. People reached out to thank her, sharing their own experiences and asking for advice. At first, the sheer volume of messages overwhelmed her, but soon she realized they weren't just burdens. They were reminders of why she kept fighting. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Tanya received an email from a young woman living in another state. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." Intrigued, Tanya opened it and began reading. The sender described being stopped by police multiple times for no reason other than the color of her skin. Each encounter left her feeling powerless and afraid until she heard about Tanya's case. Seeing someone like me stand up and fight gave me hope, the email concluded. I know things won't change overnight, but knowing people like you exist makes me believe they can get better. Tears welled up in Tanya's eyes as she finished reading. This was why she did what she did, not for fame or recognition, but to show others that they weren't alone, that their pain mattered, that their voices deserved to be heard. As the months passed, the ripple effects of Tanya's case continued to spread. Community organizations formed alliances to push for policy changes at local and national levels. Schools incorporated discussions about racial profiling and implicit bias into their curriculums. Even some police departments voluntarily adopted measures to improve transparency and trust with the communities they served. None of these changes happened overnight, and none solved every problem, but together, they marked progress. Years later, Tanya looked back on that fateful night in the park and marveled at how far she and society had come since then. Statues honoring influential figures in the fight for equality dotted public spaces, including one dedicated to her legacy. It depicted her standing tall, holding a gavel in one hand and a protest sign in the other, a symbol of resilience and determination. Children learning about history would know her name, not just as a victim of injustice, but as someone who turned adversity into action. Yet despite the accolades and recognition, Tanya remained humble. She often reminded herself and others that the fight was far from over. Racial profiling, bias, and inequality still existed, lurking in the shadows of institutions and systems built long before her time. But she believed in the power of collective effort. Every march, every petition, every conversation brought them closer to a world where justice truly applied to everyone. On quiet evenings, Tanya sometimes found herself sitting by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She thought about the journey she'd been on, the fear, the anger, the triumph, and smiled faintly. No matter how daunting the challenges ahead, she knew one thing for certain. When people stood together, they could move mountains. And that was a lesson worth remembering forever.